One of the most difficult things about using contracts in day-to-day business is the legalese that you find in them. By legalese, I mean the very dense technical legal drafting that accomplishes things that seem like they should be much simpler. So, by way of explanation, what we've got here is some legalese that transfers ownership of intellectual property between a developer and the developer's customer. So you'd think it would be as simple as saying the developer transfers relevant IP to the customer. It's actually not that simple. If you want maximum clarity, you need to talk about the legal issues involved in a transfer of IP, like the fact that we're transferring current and future IP, a representation and warranty that the developer owns the thing they're transferring, an undertaking by the developer to do all the things necessary to effect the transfer, and in some jurisdictions, we're also going to be talking about moral rights. So when we were building CodePact, which is an electronic interface for creating and signing agreements, we realized that an electronic interface gives you a lot of extra capability for abstracting away complexity and using simplified language. So if we scroll down to the equivalent drafting to what we were just looking at in the Word document, you're going to see that we're using 11 words, approximately, rather than 130. So the way we do this is by creating legalese modules that sit behind defined phrases. And to see the module behind the defined phrase, you just click. It's important to note that the module remains part of the agreement. And the way that we integrate it into the agreement is by cross-referencing between the sentence that uses the module and the module itself. It's a little bit like calling a software function and providing a software function arguments. So, as an example, the assignor is the person who's transferring away the intellectual property rights, and the assignee is the person who's receiving them. So if we read the sentence that calls this module, it's very clear who the assignor and who the assignee are just by reading the sentence. The end result is that a non-lawyer reading this document is going to understand this far better than they would understand this, because they're not losing the forest for the trees. The document is now a succinct commercial summary that still contains all of the relevant legalese. Obviously, this drafting technique isn't limited to transfers of intellectual property. You can also use it for things like confidentiality, where rather than setting out chapter and verse what confidentiality is and what exceptions there are, we just put it behind the words keep secret. We can do a similar thing in relation to limiting liability. Rather than setting out chapter and verse limiting liability to the legal minimum, given all of the legislative restrictions to that, we can just say limited to the legal minimum and pass arguments from the surrounding sentence as we did with the transfer of intellectual property. Of course, finally, we can do the same thing in respect of indemnities. Rather than setting out things like that indemnities survive the termination of the agreement and that the indemnified party can make a claim before any liability is crystallized, we can just say that the customer will cover all costs of the developer arising from the risks described below. We could even put these risks into a clickable definition. So we think that this drafting technique has a lot of potential for improving the comprehensibility of legal documents and, more importantly, allowing people to actually create their own sophisticated legal tools. So if this is of interest to you, come and have a look at what we've built at codepact.com, and do get in touch if you're interested in applying this to your own documents. We're very happy to give you advice.